What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors sits down for what should be a routine interview only to face a barrage of hostile questions and thinly veiled accusations that push him to his breaking point? Today, we're diving into the explosive confrontation that had everyone talking, where professional courtesy went out the window and tensions reached a boiling point that nobody saw coming. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because this story has more twists than you might expect. The morning started like any other at the View Studios in New York. Johnny Depp had arrived early for his scheduled appearance, promoting his latest independent film project. The makeup artist buzzed around him, applying the finishing touches as he reviewed his talking points with his publicist. Everything seemed routine, professional, exactly what you'd expect for a veteran actor making the media round. "Johnny, you look great," his publicist whispered, adjusting his jacket collar. "Remember, keep it light. Focus on the film and don't let them bait you into anything controversial." Depp nodded, his signature rings catching the studio lights as he gestured. "I've done this dance 1,000 times. It'll be fine." But as he was escorted to the iconic View set, something felt different. The usual warm pre-interview chatter from the production staff was notably absent. Instead, there were hushed whispers and darting glances. The energy in the room had an edge to it that Depp couldn't quite place. Whoopi Goldberg was already seated at the table, shuffling through her notes with an intensity that seemed unusual for what was supposed to be a promotional interview. Joy Behar sat to her right, tapping her pen against her coffee mug in a rhythmic pattern that suggested nervous energy. Sarah Haynes was reviewing something on her tablet, her brow furrowed in concentration, while Alyssa Fenhold and Sunny Host whispered quietly between themselves. "Good morning." "Johnny," Whoopi called out as he approached the guest chair. Her tone was cordial enough, but there was something in her eyes that didn't match the pleasantries. "Ready to talk about your new project?" "Absolutely," Depp replied, settling into his seat and adjusting his microphone. "Thanks for having me on the show." The countdown began, and within seconds, the familiar View theme music filled the studio. The cameras rolled, the audience applauded, and Whoopi launched into her introduction with the polished professionalism that had made her a daytime television icon. "We're here with Johnny Depp, talking about his new film. But Johnny, before we get to that, I think we need to address the elephant in the room," she said, her tone shifting noticeably from the warm introduction. "Your recent legal battles have been pretty public, and a lot of people are wondering if you've learned anything from those experiences." Depp's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the direction he'd been told the interview would take. "Well, Whoopi, I'd prefer to focus on the work, on the creative process behind this film. That's why I'm here today." "But you can't just ignore the past, can you?" Joy interjected, leaning forward with that sharp wit that had become her trademark. "I mean, when someone's been through what you've been through, don't you think the public deserves some accountability?" The tension in the room was palpable now. The audience, which had been warmly receptive moments before, seemed to sense the shift in energy. Depp straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I'm not sure what you're asking me to be accountable for," he said, his voice maintaining its measured tone despite the obvious provocation. "I've been through a very public legal process that vindicated me on multiple fronts. I'm here to talk about my art, about storytelling, about the craft that I've dedicated my life to." Sarah Haynes jumped in, her voice carrying a false sweetness that barely masked the underlying accusation. "But Johnny, don't you think that when public figures face these kinds of allegations, even if they're legally vindicated, they have a responsibility to address the broader cultural conversation, to show growth? What growth are you specifically looking for?" Depp asked, his patience beginning to wear thin. "I've been acting professionally for over 3 decades. I've worked with countless people, created characters that have brought joy to millions. That's the conversation I thought we were here to have." Sunny host, with her background as a prosecutor, couldn't resist adding her legal perspective to the mix. As someone who's worked in the legal system, I know that courtroom victories don't always tell the whole story. Sometimes there are settlements, NDAs, things that keep the full truth from coming out. Are you suggesting that I've somehow bought my way out of accountability? Depp asked, his voice dropping to a lower register that anyone familiar with his work would recognize as a warning sign. Because if that's what you're implying, I think we need to be very clear about what we're discussing here. Whoopi raised her hand as if to moderate the conversation, but her next words only added fuel to the fire. Johnny, I think what we're all trying to understand is how someone goes from being America's sweetheart, playing beloved characters like Captain Jack Sparrow, to being involved in such messy public disputes. What changed? What changed? Depp said, his voice now carrying an edge that cut through the studio air. What changed is that I found myself in a situation where telling the truth became more important than protecting a carefully crafted public image. I chose honesty over convenience, and apparently that's made some people uncomfortable. Alyssa Fenhold, who had been relatively quiet up to this point, decided to add her voice to the chorus. But Johnny, when we look at the pattern of behavior, the substance abuse issues that came out during your legal proceedings, don't you think fans deserve to know that you're addressing these problems seriously? The color drained from Depp's face. The question hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment, the seasoned actor's composure cracked completely. His hands, which had been resting calmly on the armrests of his chair, now gripped them with white-knuckled intensity. Pattern of behavior, he repeated slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them bitter. You know what, ladies? I came here in good faith to talk about a project that I'm passionate about. A small independent film that tells an important story. Instead, I'm sitting here being subjected to what feels like a coordinated attack on my character and my reputation. The studio fell silent except for the hum of the cameras and the barely audible whispers from the production crew. Even the audience seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Joy Behar, never one to back down from confrontation, pressed forward. It's not an attack, Johnny. It's journalism. It's asking the hard questions that our viewers want answered. Journalism, Depp laughed, but there was no humor in it. Is that what we're calling this? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels more like a public execution disguised as daytime television. Whoopi's expression hardened. Johnny, I think you're being a little dramatic. We're asking legitimate questions about legitimate concerns. If you can't handle that level of scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be in the public eye. That was the moment everything changed. The mask of professional courtesy that had been holding this interaction together finally slipped completely. Depp's eyes flashed with something dangerous, something that made it clear that Whoopi Goldberg had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Maybe I shouldn't be in the public eye, he repeated, his voice now carrying the full weight of decades of Hollywood politics, personal betrayals, and public humiliations. That's an interesting perspective from someone who's built their entire career on being in the public eye. The other panelists exchanged glances, suddenly realizing that their coordinated approach might have pushed things too far. But Whoopi, perhaps feeling the need to maintain her authority as the show's moderator, doubled down. The difference is, Johnny, I've never had to explain away the kind of behavior that you've had to explain away. I've never put people in positions where they felt unsafe or uncomfortable. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Everyone in the studio, from the camera operators to the audience members, understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Johnny Depp sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. His eyes locked on Whoopi's face with an intensity that made everyone uncomfortable. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Johnny Depp's eyes never left Whoopi's face, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the audio technicians had to strain to pick it up through the microphones. I've spent the last few years having my life dissected by people who weren't there, who don't know the truth, and who seem to take pleasure in watching someone's world burn down around them. But I never expected to sit across from someone I once respected and hear them repeat the same lies that nearly destroyed everything I've worked for. Whoopi shifted uncomfortably in her chair, perhaps beginning to realize that her approach had backfired spectacularly. Johnny, I'm not repeating lies. I'm asking about documented behaviors that came out in court proceedings. Documented by whom? Depp shot back, his voice rising for the first time since the interview began. By people who had every financial incentive to paint me in the worst possible light. By tabloid journalists who built their careers on sensationalism. You're sitting there acting like you're some kind of moral authority, but you're just repeating gossip and calling it journalism. Sarah Haynes tried to interject, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that only made things worse. Johnny, I think we're all trying to have a productive conversation here about accountability and growth in the entertainment industry. Depp turned to face her with such intensity that she actually flinched. Productive conversation? Sarah, let me ask you something. When was the last time you sat across from a guest and systematically tried to tear down everything they've accomplished in their career? When was the last time you ambushed someone who came here in good faith? We're not ambushing anyone, Joy Behar protested, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. We're doing our job as interviewers. Your job, Depp repeated, standing up from his chair so abruptly that his microphone pack clattered to the floor. Your job is to interview me about my film, about my craft, about the things that actually matter to the people who might want to see this movie. Instead, you've turned this into some kind of kangaroo court, where you've already decided I'm guilty of crimes I was never convicted of. The audience was completely silent now, watching this unprecedented breakdown of professional decorum with a mixture of fascination and horror. Some held up their phones, recording what they sensed was a moment that would be talked about for years to come. Sunny Hostin, perhaps feeling emboldened by her legal background, made the mistake of trying to regain control of the narrative. Johnny, the court of public opinion is different from a court of law. Just because you weren't convicted doesn't mean people don't have legitimate concerns about your behavior. Depp whirled around to face her, eyes blazing. The court of public opinion. Are you listening to yourself? You're literally saying that facts don't matter, that evidence doesn't matter, that due process doesn't matter. You're saying that mob mentality should override the legal system that this country was built on. That's not what I'm saying, Sunny backpedaled. But Depp wasn't finished. That's exactly what you're saying. You're saying that even though I proved my innocence in court, even though the truth came out, you still think I should be treated like a guilty man because it makes better television. Do you have any idea what that kind of thinking does to people? Do you have any concept of the damage you cause when you perpetuate lies for the sake of ratings? Whoopi tried to reassert her authority as the show's moderator, but her voice wavered slightly. Johnny, I think you need to calm down. We're having a discussion here. Calm down. Depp laughed. And this time there was genuine disbelief in his voice. Whoopi, you just accused me of making people feel unsafe. You sat there and implied that I'm some kind of predator who's escaped justice. You did that on national television in front of millions of people, and now you want me to calm down. I never said you were a predator, Whoopi protested. But her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. You didn't have to say it explicitly. That's the beautiful thing about what you do here, isn't it? You can destroy someone's reputation with implications and innuendo. And then, when they call you out on it, you can claim you never actually said anything directly. Depp's voice was rising now, the careful control he'd maintained throughout his career, finally giving way to raw emotion. Alyssa Fenhold made one last attempt to salvage the interview. Johnny, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Why don't we start over and talk about your film? Depp turned to look at her with something approaching pity. Start over, Alyssa. You can't unring a bell. You can't take back the accusations you've made or the damage you've done. And you know what the worst part is? You all sat there and coordinated this attack. This wasn't spontaneous questioning. You planned this. The panelists exchanged guilty glances, confirming what Depp had suspected from the moment he'd walked onto the set. "You brought me here under false pretenses," he continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his anger and disappointment. "You told my people this was about the film, about my work, and instead you turned it into a public lynching. You sat there like vultures, waiting for your moment to pick apart what's left of my reputation." Joy Behar, never one to admit defeat, made one final attempt to justify their approach. "Johnny, public figures have to be held accountable. That's just part of being famous." "Held accountable for what?" "Joy." Depp exploded, his composure finally shattering completely. "For being human, for making mistakes, for trusting the wrong people, for having my private life turned into public entertainment. I've been held accountable. I went through hell and back. Lost roles, lost friends, lost years of my life defending myself against lies. What more accountability do you want from me?" The studio was so quiet that you could hear the hum of the air conditioning system. Even the production crew had stopped moving, frozen by the raw emotion pouring out of one of Hollywood's most famous actors. "I want you to understand something," Depp continued, his voice now steady, but filled with a cold fury that was somehow more unsettling than his earlier outburst. "I've worked in this industry for over 30 years. I've created characters that children love, that bring families together, that mean something to people. I've employed thousands of people, supported countless charities, used whatever platform I have to try to make the world a little bit better." He paused, looking each of the panelists in the eye before continuing. "But none of that matters to you, does it? None of my work, none of my contributions, none of the good I've tried to do means anything because you've decided that I'm guilty of something. You've decided that I deserve to be torn down, and you're using your platform to do it." Whoopi made one last attempt to maintain some semblance of professional dignity. "Johnny, I think you're overreacting. We ask tough questions of all our guests. Overreacting?" Depp's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried more menace than any of his earlier shouting. "Whoopi, let me tell you what overreacting would be. Overreacting would be me sitting here and systematically destroying each of your careers the way you've tried to destroy mine today. Overreacting would be me using my platform to spread lies about your personal lives, your relationships, your mistakes." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, and suddenly the power dynamic in the room shifted completely. The panelists who had seemed so confident in their moral superiority moments before now looked like children who had awakened something they couldn't control. "But I'm not going to do that," Depp continued, "because unlike you, I actually have principles. I don't destroy people for entertainment. I don't turn human suffering into ratings. I don't pretend that character assassination is journalism." He reached down and unplugged his microphone completely, the small act somehow more final than any dramatic gesture could have been. "I came here to talk about art, about creativity, about the thing that's been the driving force of my entire adult life. Instead, I've been subjected to a coordinated attack by people who wouldn't know real journalism if it bit them on their collective." He caught himself, remembering that this was still daytime television, still being broadcast to millions of homes across America. The restraint somehow made his anger more powerful, not less. The unfinished sentence hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Every person in that studio knew exactly what Johnny Depp had been about to say, and somehow his restraint made the moment even more powerful than if he had completed the thought. "You know what?" he said, his voice now eerily calm. "I'm done here. I'm done with this charade. I'm done with your fake concern for accountability, and I'm done pretending that what you do here has anything to do with legitimate journalism." Whoopi, perhaps sensing that she was losing complete control of the situation, made one desperate attempt to salvage her authority. "Johnny, you can't just walk away from legitimate questions. That's not how this works." Depp stopped moving toward the exit and slowly turned back to face her. The look in his eyes was something that none of the panelists had seen before, a mixture of disappointment, anger, and what could only be described as pity. "Legitimate questions," he repeated softly. "Whoopi, let me ask you a legitimate question. When you were going through your own personal struggles, when you were dealing with addiction, when you were fighting to rebuild your career and your reputation, how would you have felt if someone had ambushed you on television and tried to tear you down for entertainment?" The question hit Whoopi like a physical blow. Her own struggles with substance abuse and the difficult periods of her career were well documented, and having them thrown back at her in this context clearly caught her off guard. "That's different," she stammered, but even she didn't seem to believe her own words. "How is it different?" Depp pressed, taking a step back toward the table. "Because you're the host now instead of the guest? Because you're the one asking the questions instead of answering them? Or is it different because you've decided that your struggles were legitimate, while mine are somehow character flaws?" Sarah Haynes tried to come to Whoopi's defense, but her voice lacked any real conviction. "Johnny, I think what Whoopi is trying to say is that when you're promoting a project, people naturally want to know about your journey, about how you've grown." "My journey?" Depp's voice rose again, the careful control he'd been maintaining beginning to slip once more. "Sarah, you want to know about my journey? I've been sober for over 2 years. I've rebuilt relationships that I thought were lost forever. I found peace with parts of my life that I thought would haunt me until the day I died. I have learned to trust again, to create again, to find joy in the work that once brought me nothing but pain." The raw honesty in his voice was startling. This wasn't the polished media response celebrities usually gave when discussing personal struggles. This was real, unfiltered emotion from someone who had clearly been through hell and found his way back. "But none of that matters to you," he continued, his eyes moving from one panelist to another. "None of my actual growth, none of my real journey means anything because it doesn't fit the narrative you want to tell. You want me to be the fallen star, the cautionary tale, the train wreck that makes your audience feel better about their own lives." Joy Behar, who had been uncharacteristically quiet for the last few minutes, finally found her voice again. "Johnny, that's not fair. We're not trying to tear you down. We're trying to have an honest conversation about accountability in Hollywood." Depp laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. "Accountability in Hollywood? Joy, that's rich. Coming from an industry that protected Harvey Weinstein for decades, that turned a blind eye to countless abuses of power, that systematically silenced victims for the sake of profits. You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about the executives who knew what was happening and did nothing. Let's talk about the agents who enabled predators. Let's talk about the media outlets that buried stories to protect their access." The panelists shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Depp had just turned the tables completely, forcing them to confront the broader context of Hollywood's accountability problem rather than focusing solely on his personal issues. "But that's not the conversation you want to have, is it?" he continued relentlessly. "Because that would require actual journalism. That would require courage. It's much easier to go after someone who's already been through the legal system, someone who's already been publicly humiliated, someone who can't fight back without looking like the bad guy." Sonny Hostin made one last attempt to justify their approach. "Johnny, I think you're mischaracterizing what we're trying to do here. We're simply asking questions that our viewers want answered." "Your viewers," Depp repeated, shaking his head in disgust. "Do you really think your viewers want to see someone ambushed and humiliated on national television? Do you think they tune in to watch you destroy people who come here in good faith? Or do you just tell yourself that to justify what you do?" He paused, looking directly into the camera for the first time since the interview began. "I want to say something directly to the people watching at home. I came here today to talk about a film that I'm proud of. A small independent project that tells a story I believe in. Instead, I've been subjected to a coordinated attack by people who seem to think that destroying someone's reputation is a form of entertainment. The camera operators exchanged glances, unsure whether they should continue filming what was clearly an unprecedented breach of daytime television protocol. I want you to ask yourselves, Depp continued, still looking directly into the camera, is this the kind of journalism you want? Is this the kind of discourse that helps our society move forward? Is this the way you want public figures to be treated when they're trying to share their work with the world? Whoopi finally found her voice again, but it was clear that she had lost all control of the situation. Johnny, I think you're being unfair to us and to our audience. We're professionals trying to do our job. Depp turned away from the camera and fixed her with a stare that could have melted steel. Professionals? Whoopi, let me tell you what professionals do. Professionals prepare for interviews by researching their guests' current projects. Professionals ask questions that are relevant to the reason someone agreed to appear on their show. Professionals treat their guests with basic human dignity, even when they're asking difficult questions. He began walking toward the exit again, but his voice carried clearly throughout the studio. What you did here today wasn't professional. It was an ambush disguised as an interview, character assassination disguised as journalism, and entertainment disguised as accountability. Alyssa Farrah Griffin made one final desperate attempt to keep him from leaving. Johnny, please don't go. We can start over. We can talk about your film. Depp stopped at the edge of the set and turned back one last time. Start over? Alyssa, you can't start over after what happened here today. You can't take back the accusations. You can't undo the damage, and you certainly can't pretend that this was ever about my film. He looked at each of the panelists one final time, his expression a mixture of disappointment and something that might have been sadness. I hope someday you understand the difference between holding someone accountable and publicly destroying them for entertainment. I hope you realize that there are real human beings behind the celebrity personas you seem to enjoy tearing apart. The studio fell completely silent as Depp walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Just before he reached the door, he turned back one final time. "And Whoopi," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the studio, "the next time you want to question someone's character, you might want to take a long look in the mirror first, because what I saw here today tells me a lot more about who you are than it does about who I am." With that, Johnny Depp walked off the View set, leaving behind 5 panelists who sat in stunned silence, an audience that had just witnessed television history, and a crew that had no idea how to handle what had just unfolded before their cameras. The silence stretched on for nearly 30 seconds before Whoopi finally managed to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll be right back after this commercial break." But everyone in that studio knew that there was no coming back from what had just happened. They had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected actors too far, and he had responded with a level of honesty and raw emotion that had completely destroyed their carefully constructed narrative. As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, one thing was crystal clear. This was a moment that would be talked about, analyzed, and remembered for years to come. Johnny Depp had walked off the View. But in doing so, he had delivered one of the most powerful indictments of modern celebrity journalism that daytime television had ever seen.